Hi, I'm Keegan with the Econ Tutoring Center, and welcome to our live workshop on how to understand the impact of taxes on supply and demand and the resulting consumer and producer surplus and whatnot. So this is a live video that's unedited, so if we do make any mistakes, hopefully we'll correct them as we work, but if not, feel free to leave a comment on the video. That would be great. This problem that we have is going to be first taking a look at at a set of functions, finding the equilibrium that they determine, and then we're going to find what things look like after a tax is introduced. A tax of $1, and we're going to look at how that tax changed the consumer and producer surplus and find the deadweight loss associated with the tax. The first step, I'm going to go ahead and write up our demand and supply functions, which give us these supply and demand curves or lines as they are here. So the first step is to solve for the equilibrium between these. And so that's going to be where these two intersect. When these two curves intersect, they clearly have the same, sorry, this is quantity and this is price. Then when these two lines intersect, they have the same quantity. They meet at some point along this. We call that Q star. Okay, and so what we can do is set them both equal to the same quantity, and therefore set these two formulas equal to each other. Okay, and then just ignoring this Q in the middle, we see that these two things are equal to each other. We can solve for the price that makes that happen. So we'd add 10p and add 400. So we end up with 600 equals, it's not 500p, it's 50p. Okay, so 600 equals 60p, and that gives us that p equals 10. Okay, so the equilibrium price is 10. And then we can actually just plug that into either one of these, the demand or supply functions, to find the equilibrium quantity. So 200 minus 10 times p, if we let p equal 10, then we have 200 minus 10 times 10. 10 times 10 is 100, so 200 minus 100 is 100. So Q star is 100. P star equals 10 and Q star equals 100. Now we want to take into account the effect of a tax. So it's a $1 tax. The supply curve is being shifted by $1, and it's a shift up, but it's a decrease in supply. Okay. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and draw it a little, even though it's $1, I'm going to draw it a little bit further away so that it's easier to see kind of the direction. Okay, so it's a change from here, from this original to this. We'll call this second supply curve S prime, and we can actually go ahead, let's write our P star over here. P star equals 10, Q star equals 100. Go ahead and erase this. So to think about the shifted supply curve, we're going to use, instead of P, we're going to use P minus 1, because that's the price that they end up actually getting. Right? Whatever the price ends up being, $1 less is how much the supplier is actually making. So we have we'll call this new supply curve QS prime, and we'll say that's equal to negative 400 plus 50 times P minus 1. Okay? And so then once again, all we have to do is find the equilibrium between this and the original demand curve. Okay? So negative 400 plus 50 times P minus 1 equals 200 minus 10P. Okay. Now this part is just some algebra. We end up with negative 400 plus 50P minus 50 equals 200 minus 10P. Something. And then we simplify that. We end up with negative 450 plus 50P equals 200 minus 10P. So we can move the 10P over to this side and the 450 over to that side. Or in other words, we add 450 to both sides, and 60P equals 650. Okay? And so P, this last new P, we'll call this, label it on the graph. It's this new intersection between the same old demand curve and the new supply curve. We'll call that P prime star. Okay? And that's going to equal some number, and that number is 650 divided by 60, 10.83. P prime star equals 10.83. Let's move to determining the quantity now, because we can see that the intersection of this new supply curve and the demand curve is a smaller quantity. We'll call this Q prime star. Okay? And so for that, all we have to do is plug our new price, 10.83, into either the supply curve, either the new supply curve or the demand curve. Let's do the demand. So that's going to be 200 minus 10 times 10.83. And that's going to be approximately equal to 1.6. And it's like 6.7. Okay? So that is going to be our Q prime star. 91.67. All right, and that's also this, 91.67. That's probably impossible to read, but you know it's 91.67. We saw an increase as a result of this tax. We saw an increase from $10 to $10.83, and what that means is that there's a $1 tax being imposed on this firm every time they, so let's say they're selling red markers, and every time they sell one, they're paying that $1 tax, right? So that's it's a difference between 1083, where they're receiving 1083 from the customer, and they're paying $1. So what are they in the end receiving? Well, it'd be 983, right? So how much of that tax is being absorbed by the customer? It's this 83 cents, which was the kind of the difference between 1083 and the original price, which is $10. Okay, so so we see that there's the amount of tax paid by the consumer. So 0.83 is what the consumer, the portion of the $1 tax that the consumer is paying, and then the producer obviously would be paying the $1 minus 0.83, which is going to be 0.17. Okay, so 0.83, and if we wanted to find the total, like portion of the tax that was paid by consumers across all units of the good, we would do 0.83 times the quantity that were sold to consumers, which is 91.67. And likewise for producers, if we want to find out how much they ended up paying, how much it came out of their potential profits, so to speak, then it'd be 0.17 times 91.67. Okay, and those are 73.39 for the consumers and 15.28 for the producers. So if you ever hear about there's a tax being put on some good, and then people say, well, they're just going to pass it all on to the consumer. Well, that can be true, but usually the producer is also going to absorb some of that cost of the tax, and this method allows us to determine kind of what that breakdown actually ends up being if we know the supply and demand and the size of the tax and so forth. So that's actually, we wanted to find the tax incidence, and we did. So the consumer tax was 73.39, and the producer tax was 15.28. All right, so now we want to find the consumer and producer surplus both before and after the tax. So the consumer surplus, recall, is the area that's below the demand curve but above the price. And what that represents is the willingness to pay being above the price actually paid. So like a consumer says, you know, I would pay 10 bucks for this marker, and they only paid 5 bucks, then they would kind of get this surplus happiness of about $5 worth. And then if the next person came along and said they were willing to pay $9 and they paid $5, then there's $4 of surplus, and so on. So we recognize this area below the demand curve and above the price line as being consumer surplus. And so it ends up being a triangle, and we can find the area of that triangle. So what we would look for is the base times height times 1/2. So the base is going to be from 0 out to the quantity, the equilibrium quantity. And since we're talking about before the tax, that would be 100 times the height, which would be this from the equilibrium price, which was 10 before the tax, up to this intercept between the demand curve and the vertical axis. Okay? So this height times the quantity times 1/2. And so really quickly, we're going to want to solve for what this intercept is. And so what we're using is this demand curve, and we're looking for, so the intercept happens when quantity is 0. So we set quantity to 0 and find out what the appropriate price ends up being. So 0 equals 200 minus 10p, and turns out that is p equals 20. So this is 20, and the price here is 10. So this height is 10. The equilibrium price is 10. The greatest willingness to pay is 20. So the height is 10, and the base is 100. So you have 100 times 10 times 1/2 equals the consumer surplus, and it ends up being 100 times 5, which is 500. Okay, so the consumer surplus in the original case, we'll call that star, equals 500. Okay, now it's the same process for finding the producer surplus, except that we're looking for the area above the supply curve and below the price line. So we already know the price line is at 10. We already know it's going to be the quantity of 100 for determining the area of this bottom triangle. And so now we just need to find what this point is in order to find the height. So to do that, once again, we're looking for the point where quantity is 0 and on the supply curve. So we have 0, set Q equal to 0. 0 equals negative 400 plus 50p. So 50p equals 400, and then p is going to equal 8 once we do that algebra. So it's the distance between 10 and 8 times 100. Oh, thank you. Just have a revolving door of markers. Great. So 2 times, so this was the height, was 2, times 100, which is the base, times 1/2, equals 100. So producer surplus star is 100. And that's before the tax, okay? And then if we wanted to find the total surplus, it would just be 500 plus 100 for 600, right? I guess we could, total surplus star equals 600. Now it's the same process once again for the producer and consumer surplus after the tax, okay? So once again, we're going to try and find, and the price line now is 10.83. The demand curve hasn't shifted, so it's still going to be, the height is 20 minus 10.83, and then the quantity has changed to 91.67. So the consumer surplus equals this height, which is 20 minus 10.83, which is going to be 10.17, times 91.67 times 1/2, right? So this being the base, which is the new quantity, and then yeah, the height and then 1/2. And that ends up equaling 420.14. And so we can just go ahead and plug that in, or we save that value. That's the consumer surplus after the tax. And so we can already see that consumer surplus has decreased as a result of the tax. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and solve for the producer surplus after the tax, PS prime star. And it's similar, except this time we're using the newer supply curve. So we're going to have to find where that intersects with this vertical axis, which is when Q equals 0. We already have the price, which is 1083. So this is the triangle we're trying to find. And we already have the new quantity. But actually, we don't have to use a formula for finding out where this is on the vertical axis, because we know that we shifted this supply curve up by $1. So it's going to end up intersecting at 9. But just for the sake of of making sure that everything works and verifying that this trick works as well, we can just go ahead and solve it. So let's do the QS prime was negative 400 plus 50 times P minus 1. So we can set that equal to 0. 0 equals negative 400 plus 50P minus 50. So if we distribute out the P minus 1, that's what we end up with. So 3/5. So let's go ahead and pull these to the other side. 50P equals 450. And so then P equals, so we hold 9 because we shifted the supply curve up by $1. The distance between 9 and 10.83 is our height, and that's 1.83. Okay, so 1.83 is our height times our base, which is 91.67 times 1/2. That ends up equaling 84.03. So PS prime star, which is the producer surplus after the tax, is 84.03. Yeah, so we saw a drop in producer and consumer surplus after the tax. If we wanted to, we could total these up. 420 plus 84 is going to be 504, and then 0.17, so it's going to be 504.17 total surplus prime. We found consumer surplus and producer surplus before and after the tax. Check. And our last step is to find the deadweight loss. Now, the deadweight loss, this is getting really hard to read. I'm going to go ahead and redraw this diagram because I think this is good to understand. What we're going to be illustrating is the deadweight loss, which is this. Okay? This whole region is, okay, so originally you had this triangle as the consumer surplus, and this triangle as the producer surplus. But then when you see the shift as a result of the tax, you see this smaller triangle as the consumer surplus, and this smaller triangle as the producer surplus. And what that means at the end of the day is that consumer surplus and producer surplus have shrunk. There's also some tax to account for that's been collected, which is something that's useful. It's now the government has a bunch of money that can spend on something useful. And so that is a region that we count when we think about welfare. So, so the consumer surplus and producer surplus plus, these two tax numbers would give us the kind of total societal welfare after the tax. But what we find is that there is a region that's left out, which is this. That's completely lost from the economy, and that's because a smaller quantity is being produced and consumed, so there's kind of a real loss of surplus. And so that's the deadweight loss, this loss in consumer and producer surplus. So let's calculate this deadweight loss. One way to do it would be to add up the CS star plus PS star and subtract CS prime star, subtract CS prime star plus PS prime star plus the tax revenue. Okay, that difference would be a difference in total welfare, and it would end up being the deadweight loss. For our purposes, it's really an alternative way is to look at it geometrically and say, okay, well, the tax we know is $1. The base is really $1. The height is the difference between the two equilibrium quantities. One was 100, I think it was. Yep, Q star is 100. And then Q prime star is 91.67. So the difference between those ends up being 8.33, right? Because it's a triangle. Times 1/2 is 1/2 times 8.33, which is 4.18 or something. Well, we found the deadweight loss. So it's a bit of a long problem, but hopefully that helped. And actually, it came to my attention that the numbers that we had for the multiplication for the consumer and producer tax were slightly off. And they should have been, the consumer tax was 76, about 76, and the producer tax was 14.7. But notice that that is just a multiplication error, and not everything we wrote on the board was correct except for the fact that it equaled 76. It actually, or whatever we wrote before 76, right? So other than that, the whole process has been correct. Yeah. So good luck doing this on your own, and I hope that this will help you. And yeah, once again, if you have questions or comments, feel free to leave a comment on the video.